Mia Reynolds, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney with a deep love for her suburban home, never imagined that her greatest legal challenge would come from an overzealous HOA. A woman who had spent years practicing law in high-profile cases, Mia had always been confident in her knowledge of the rules and the law. But now, standing on her porch with a letter in hand about her mailbox color, she felt the creeping dread that only comes from dealing with something completely unexpected. Her home, a charming 3-bedroom nestled on a tree-lined street, was her sanctuary. After spending years defending others, she had finally found peace here, away from the chaos of the courtrooms. Every evening, she'd step outside, take in the fresh air, and savor the tranquility that came with owning her own piece of the world. But today, that peace had been shattered. The letter in her hand was from none other than Karen Mitchell, the president of the neighborhood's HOA, and it was about her mailbox. Yes, her mailbox. Mia rolled her eyes as she read the fine print of the violation notice. According to the HOA, her mailbox, simple unadorned, was a disruptive aesthetic blemish because it did not adhere to the HOA's very specific guidelines. They'd given her 30 days to either repaint it or face a hefty fine. This was just the beginning. Karen Mitchell, whose role as HOA president seemed to fuel her sense of entitlement, had always been the self-proclaimed ruler of the neighborhood. Every rule, no matter how trivial, was her domain. She'd once been overheard boasting that the HOA's bylaws existed only to make sure things were proper, meaning everything had to be exactly as she saw fit. Perfect. Just what I need, Mia muttered to herself, clutching the letter. Let's see what you've got, Karen. As she stood on her porch, Karen could be seen across the street, eyeing her property from behind her perfectly manicured garden. It wasn't just about the mailbox. This was Karen's latest power move. Mia knew she had to fight back, because when you're a property attorney, no one tramples on your rights without consequence. Karen's smirk was almost audible as Mia made her way back into the house, already crafting her next move. This wasn't just about an insignificant violation. This was the HOA overstepping its bounds, and Mia wasn't the kind to let that slide. HOA's first power move. Mia knew that Karen wouldn't stop at a simple mailbox violation. As an attorney, Mia understood that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle, and sure enough, less than a week later, another letter arrived. This one wasn't about her mailbox. It was a fine for unauthorized exterior modifications. Apparently, the HOA didn't approve of the small flower bed she'd planted around her porch, despite it having been there for over 2 years. Unauthorized exterior modifications? Mia scoffed as she opened the letter. This is absurd. It wasn't just the fine that struck Mia. It was the tone of the letter. It was clear that Karen and the HOA board were fully expecting compliance. Karen had even signed the letter herself, as though she were some kind of monarch issuing a decree. Mia wasn't one to back down from a fight, and certainly not over something as trivial as flowers. But she knew the HOA had its sights set on her, so she gathered her thoughts and prepared her response. She'd researched the local zoning laws, studied the HOA's own rules, and made a list of the violations Karen and her board had been committing over the past year. She wasn't about to let them intimidate her into compliance. She called up her neighbor, Mrs. Thomas, who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone and had seen the HOA's tactics firsthand. Mrs. Thomas, do you have any idea why Karen's been targeting me? Mia asked. Oh, honey, it's not just you, Mrs. Thomas replied with a chuckle. Karen's got it out for anyone who doesn't fall in line. She's got this idea that if she can scare people into following her rules, she'll look like the queen of the neighborhood. Mia's jaw tightened. This wasn't about flowers or mailboxes. This was about Karen's unchecked sense of authority. And Mia wasn't going to let it stand. The next day, she marched to the HOA office with a response in hand, the official language carefully crafted to both defend her position and make it clear she would not comply with their unreasonable demands. She handed it over to the receptionist, who gave her a puzzled look but dutifully passed it along. Later that afternoon, as Mia worked at her kitchen table, her phone rang. It was Karen. Mia, this is Karen. I'm afraid I have some bad news. I've had to involve the inspectors, and they're scheduled to visit your property tomorrow. Mia's blood ran cold. The HOA had sent inspectors before, but this was different. Karen was making a move to escalate things, expecting Mia to cave. The threat was obvious. Karen, Mia said, keeping her voice steady, you have no authority to inspect my property. And just so you know, I'm fully aware of my rights. If you think you can bully me into submission, you're mistaken. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a brittle laugh. "We'll see about that, won't we?" Karen sneered before hanging up. Mia stared at the phone in her hand. It was clear that Karen was going to take this as far as she could. And now, with inspectors on the way, Mia knew she had to act fast. It wasn't just about her home anymore. It was about standing up for every homeowner who had been bullied by Karen and the HOA. That night, Mia took to her computer, digging into the HOA's bylaws and researching the power of local governments over neighborhood associations. She wasn't going to let Karen get away with this. She had a plan, and she was going to execute it, and she wouldn't be alone. Mia wasn't the first to feel Karen's wrath, and she wouldn't be the last. As the inspectors arrived the next morning, Mia stood at the door, ready for whatever they tried. "You're not welcome here without a warrant," she said firmly as she opened the door to the two men in uniform. The men hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. They had heard about Karen's overreach, but didn't realize the full extent until now. Mia wasn't just any homeowner. She was a lawyer, and she knew the law better than they did. "We're just following orders," one of them muttered. "Well," Mia replied with a knowing smile, "then you can take those orders right back to Karen. This is my property, and I'm exercising my rights." The men stood frozen for a moment before nodding and backing away, not wanting to get caught up in a legal mess they couldn't win. As the inspectors left, Mia closed the door behind her with a quiet, triumphant click. She wasn't backing down. It was time for Karen to realize she had messed with the wrong homeowner. The HOA escalates the conflict. Karen didn't take Mia's pushback lightly. As the days passed, the intensity of the HOA's actions grew, and the war over Mia's property had officially escalated. Mia had already beaten back their initial attempts, but Karen wasn't about to let one attorney stand in her way. In fact, she was determined to turn this into a personal vendetta. A week after the confrontation with the inspectors, Mia received a letter that shook her to the core. A formal warning about ongoing violations, this time with threats of eviction if she didn't comply. The HOA claimed that her actions were interfering with the neighborhood's harmony. But Mia knew this was just Karen's way of punishing her for standing up. But Mia wasn't afraid. She had spent her entire career fighting in courtrooms, dealing with larger issues, but this one felt different. It was personal. As an attorney, she was well-versed in the ways of legal intimidation, but Karen's actions were crossing into dangerous territory. Karen's latest move was even more brazen. She had now involved the local authorities, calling them on Mia for everything from unapproved landscaping to creating a public nuisance. When Mia spoke with the officers who came to her door, it became evident that Karen had exaggerated the violations to the point of absurdity. "Ma'am, I have to admit," one officer said hesitantly, "there's nothing illegal going on here. It's just the HOA trying to get their way. We can't enforce these kinds of things." Mia nodded, grateful for the officer's understanding. But the moment Karen got wind of the officer's visit, she escalated things even further. A new set of inspectors arrived, this time with a much more forceful attitude. They walked around her property, measuring things that didn't need measuring and taking notes on irrelevant details. Mia wasn't going to let them push her around. With the knowledge of local laws and her legal background, she knew this was Karen's way of trying to break her spirit. But Mia wasn't a quitter. She was just getting started. As she sat at her desk later that night, she pulled up the HOA's financial reports, looking for any signs of misconduct. What she found was enough to make her blood boil. The HOA had been pocketing money from residents for special assessments, all without any legitimate basis. This was more than just a battle over aesthetics. It was about corruption at the highest levels of the HOA board. And Karen? Mia was sure that she was at the center of it all. The HOA had been exploiting its power for years, and Mia was about to expose it. She began compiling her evidence, financial records, testimonies from neighbors who had been silenced with threats, and documentation proving that Karen had made decisions based on personal vendettas, not the well-being of the neighborhood. But Mia wasn't doing this alone. She reached out to the other homeowners who had been impacted by Karen's actions. One by one, they came forward, ready to join her in exposing the corruption. Mrs. Thomas, her elderly neighbor, had been forced to pay for unnecessary fines every year. And Jason, a young couple who had just moved in, had been told their garage door color wasn't approved. It was a long list, and Mia was ready to turn it all into ammunition. As she prepared to take legal action, Mia received an unexpected visit. It was from one of the quieter board members of the HOA, Sarah. She was clearly uncomfortable, but Mia could tell she had something important to say. "I know what Karen's been doing," Sarah confessed in a low voice. "And I can't stand by anymore. There's corruption in this HOA, and it's only getting worse." Mia's heart raced. She had suspected as much, but hearing it from someone inside the board was a huge step forward. Sarah went on to explain how Karen had coerced other members into voting in her favor, all the while lining her pockets with fines and fees that had no basis in the bylaws. "I'm going to help you," Sarah said, her voice filled with determination. "But you have to be careful. Karen will stop at nothing to keep her grip on this place." Mia nodded. "I've got this, Sarah. Together, we'll take her down." With Sarah on her side, Mia's resolve only grew stronger. The battle was about to intensify, and she wasn't about to back down now. As Karen continued to escalate her petty attempts to control Mia's life, Mia found herself gathering more and more evidence. She was ready to bring it all to light, and when the time came, Karen wouldn't know what hit her. This wasn't just a battle for Mia's home. It was a fight to expose the corruption that had poisoned the entire HOA. And Mia wasn't going to stop until Karen was held accountable. The HOA oversteps and the protagonist strikes back. Karen had made a fatal mistake. In her quest to break Mia's resolve, she had taken things too far. What started as petty fines and property inspections had escalated into something much more sinister. This time, the HOA had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Mia had expected Karen to escalate things, but nothing could prepare her for what happened next. One morning, Mia was greeted by the unmistakable sound of construction machinery outside her home. Startled, she rushed to the window and saw a crew digging up her driveway. Without any warning or permission, the HOA had decided that Mia's driveway was in violation of their aesthetic rules, and they were going to fix it. She stormed out of her house, fury building in her chest as she approached the crew. The foreman looked up, startled. "Who authorized this?" Mia demanded. "You can't just come onto my property like this." The foreman shifted uneasily. "We're just following orders," Karen said. "Karen," Mia interrupted, her voice rising. "This is my property, and unless I see something in writing from the city, you're not touching a single inch of it." The workers hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Mia was already dialing her lawyer, ready to bring in legal action against this blatant overreach. But Karen wasn't going to back down so easily. She had every intention of continuing her reign of terror, and now she was even more determined to force Mia into submission. Later that day, Mia received a call from her lawyer. "Mia, I've been hearing about this. Karen's going too far. This isn't just a violation of property rights, it's harassment at this point. You've got a solid case to take her down." But Karen wasn't just targeting Mia's driveway. She had started telling other residents that Mia was the cause of all their problems, stirring up resentment among the neighbors who didn't know the full story. Some were beginning to question Mia, believing Karen's narrative that Mia was simply a troublemaker who refused to follow the rules. The next day, Karen called the police, reporting that Mia's garage was a disturbance. It was a ludicrous claim, but Karen was hoping that if she involved the authorities, it would scare Mia into compliance. When the officers arrived, Mia was ready. She had already spoken to them about Karen's antics, and they knew the situation well. The officer who greeted her shook his head when he saw the patrol car pull up in front of her home. "Mia, you're not the problem here. This is all Karen." "I've got your back," the officer said, clearly frustrated with the situation. Mia smirked. "You're not the first to say that." Karen was standing across the street, watching with a smug look on her face. She expected the police to back her up, but instead, the officers told her to go back inside her house. The violation wasn't real, and they weren't going to get involved in something as trivial as an HOA complaint. But Karen wasn't finished. She had one last, desperate move up her sleeve, a fake lawsuit. Mia received a court summons, claiming she was in non-compliance with the HOA's rules, though no official documentation or violation had ever been filed. The lawsuit was a sham, an attempt to intimidate Mia into surrendering. As soon as Mia read the document, she knew this was Karen's final, reckless push. It was a bluff, and Mia wasn't going to fall for it. Mia sat down at her desk, drafting a legal cease and desist letter. She wasn't just going to fight this in court. She was going to take Karen down publicly. She would expose Karen's tactics, the HOA's corruption, and the lies that had fueled their harassment. When she delivered the letter to the HOA's office, the receptionist didn't even try to hide her surprise. "I didn't think you'd fight this," the receptionist said, eyes wide. Well, I didn't think Karen would be this foolish, Mia replied with a tight smile. But she's made a big mistake. That afternoon, Mia attended the HOA meeting with the cease and desist letter in hand. Karen was sitting at the head of the table, her usual smug demeanor in full force. But when Mia walked in, everything shifted. The board members grew quiet, unsure of what to expect. Mia stood up, holding the letter high. "This," she said, her voice ringing through the room, "is a legal document that proves Karen Mitchell and this HOA have been engaging in illegal practices. I've gathered enough evidence to prove that Karen has been targeting residents unfairly and unlawfully." The room fell silent. Karen's face went pale as the board members exchanged uneasy glances. "You can all choose to ignore this, but understand this. I will fight this, and I will expose every lie, every manipulation. You have two choices. You can do the right thing, or you can face the consequences of Karen's actions." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but Mia cut her off. "I'm done being intimidated. It's time for the truth to come out." The meeting ended in chaos, with the board members too shocked to respond. As Mia walked out of the room, she knew the battle was far from over, but now the tide had turned. Karen's power was slipping, and Mia was about to make sure it never came back. Karen's final, desperate move. Mia could feel the pressure mounting as the HOA's stranglehold on the neighborhood began to loosen. But she knew Karen wasn't going to give up without one final, desperate move. Karen had always believed that her position as HOA president made her untouchable, but Mia was about to shatter that illusion. A week after the chaotic HOA meeting, Mia received another disturbing notice from the HOA. This time, it wasn't a fine or warning. It was an order to have her water shut off. The HOA, under Karen's instructions, had contacted the local utility company, claiming that Mia's property had an outstanding balance, which was completely false. The goal was clear: to force Mia to back down by cutting off her access to water. When Mia received the call from the utility company, she was livid. "What are you talking about? My account is up to date," she argued with the customer service representative. "We've received instructions from the HOA to shut off your utilities," the voice on the other end said, clearly uncomfortable. "They've claimed there's an issue with your property." Mia's blood ran cold. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was criminal. Karen was taking matters into her own hands, using her influence to commit an illegal act. Without wasting a second, Mia picked up the phone and called her lawyer. "I need a temporary restraining order, now. The HOA has crossed a line." Within hours, Mia had obtained a restraining order against Karen and the HOA. The next morning, she stormed into the utility office with the legal papers in hand, demanding that the water shut-off order be reversed immediately. The manager of the utility company took one look at the papers and quickly acknowledged the error. "I'm terribly sorry, Ms. Reynolds. I'll have this sorted out right away." As Mia left the office, she felt the weight of the battle lift slightly from her shoulders. But Karen wasn't done yet. Later that afternoon, Mia received an unexpected knock on her door. When she opened it, she was face to face with a police officer. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you about a trespassing complaint," the officer said, flashing his badge. "It appears someone has reported you for violating a local ordinance." Mia's heart sank. She knew exactly who was behind this latest complaint, Karen. But this time, she was prepared. She had anticipated that Karen might escalate things even further and had been documenting every interaction, keeping detailed records of Karen's actions. "This is nothing but harassment," Mia said firmly, refusing to back down. "There's no violation here, and you're wasting your time." The officer seemed conflicted but nodded. "I understand, ma'am. I'll need to take a report, but I'll make sure to include that this is clearly a frivolous claim." After the officer left, Mia was both frustrated and more determined than ever. Karen's behavior was getting worse, and it seemed like she was willing to break any law to maintain her grip on the neighborhood. But Mia was no longer just defending her home. She was fighting for the truth to be heard, for every resident who had been intimidated and silenced. The next day, Mia sent a letter to the HOA's board members, demanding a public meeting to address Karen's actions. She wasn't just going to sit back and let Karen and the HOA board continue their tyrannical rule. Mia made it clear that she was prepared to take the fight to the media, if necessary. She had enough evidence to make Karen's entire reign of terror public. When Karen received Mia's letter, she went ballistic. "How dare she challenge me like this?" Karen seethed, pacing in her living room. "I'll make sure she regrets this." But Mia knew that Karen's arrogance was her greatest weakness. She had spent months gathering evidence, and now it was time to use it. With the help of her lawyer, Mia filed a formal complaint against Karen and the HOA, listing every violation and illegal action they had taken. The legal documents were clear, and the facts were undeniable. At the next HOA meeting, Mia took a seat at the front of the room, her posture strong and unwavering. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and she wasn't about to let Karen intimidate her anymore. Karen entered the room, her usual smug expression quickly morphing into a frown when she saw the stack of legal documents Mia had brought with her. Mia stood up, addressing the room with unwavering confidence. "Today, I'm not here just for myself. I'm here for every resident who has been bullied and lied to by this HOA. We are done with Karen's tactics, and it's time for the truth to come out." She handed over the documents to the board members. "I have proof of illegal activity, proof of financial mismanagement, and proof of harassment. Karen Mitchell has been abusing her position for far too long, and it's time for this to end." The room fell silent. Karen's face flushed with anger, but she knew she was cornered. Mia's evidence was irrefutable. As the meeting progressed, board members exchanged nervous glances, some even looking uncomfortable with the knowledge of Karen's actions. For the first time, it seemed like they were questioning their loyalty to her. But Karen wasn't backing down. She shot Mia a venomous glare. "You think you've won? This isn't over, Mia. You've only just started a war you can't win." Mia smiled. "I'm not the one at war, Karen. You are. And this time, you've crossed a line you can't come back from." As Karen stood up to leave, Mia could see the cracks in her confidence. The time for Karen's reign was over, and Mia had made sure of it. HOA crumbles and Karen's downfall. The storm was coming, and Karen could feel it. The air had changed, and for the first time since she'd taken control of the HOA, Karen was beginning to lose her grip. Mia had done more than just defend her property. She had ignited a movement. The neighborhood, once divided by fear and complacency, was now united in its desire to take down the overbearing HOA president. A week after the explosive HOA meeting, the results of Mia's actions were already beginning to show. Several neighbors who had been too intimidated to speak out before were now coming forward, sharing their stories of how Karen had manipulated them, fined them for trivial violations, and used her position to enforce her own personal vendettas. The once solid reputation of the HOA was beginning to crumble like a house of cards. The neighborhood's Facebook page, once filled with complaints about minor infractions and trivial rules, had exploded with support for Mia. The residents who had been silently watching from the sidelines now found themselves joining together in solidarity. They had had enough of Karen's reign of terror. Mia knew she had to keep the pressure on. Her lawyer had already filed a formal lawsuit against Karen and the HOA for financial mismanagement and harassment. But Mia wasn't just fighting for her property anymore. She was fighting for the whole community. She wasn't about to let Karen get away with the destruction she had caused. It wasn't long before the city council took notice. The numerous complaints, the public outcry, and the legal action Mia had initiated were enough to catch the attention of local government officials. A full investigation into the HOA was launched, and the board members, one by one, began to distance themselves from Karen's leadership. The support that Karen had relied on for so long was vanishing, and the cracks in the HOA's foundation deepened. Karen, however, remained defiant. She refused to accept that her time was up. "They're all against me, but I won't back down," she muttered to herself as she paced around her living room. This isn't over. But the writing was on the wall. The community had turned against her, the legal system was closing in, and the HOA's days were numbered. The final blow came when the city issued a public statement confirming that the HOA's actions had been illegal. Not only would they be fined, but the entire HOA board, including Karen, would face consequences for their actions. As Mia walked through the neighborhood one sunny afternoon, she spotted Karen's moving truck parked in front of her house. The for sale sign was already planted in the front yard, and the once proud Karen was packing up her belongings, her pride shattered. It was clear that Karen had lost everything. Mia walked past the house with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The battle had been long and exhausting, but it had been worth it. The neighborhood was finally free from Karen's grip, and Mia knew that, in the end, justice had prevailed. Karen's downfall was swift. The public outcry, the mounting legal pressure, and the support Mia had rallied were too much for her to overcome. As the last of her belongings were loaded into the truck, Karen looked around one final time at the house she'd once called home. She had spent years intimidating her neighbors, dictating the rules, and enforcing her vision of what the community should look like. But now, she was being forced out, humiliated in front of everyone she'd once tried to control. Mia stood at the end of the street, watching as Karen's moving truck pulled away. For a brief moment, she felt a sense of closure. Karen had tried to destroy her home, but in the end, it was Karen who had been destroyed. Later that day, Mia walked into her home, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a wave of peace wash over her. The battle was over, but the war had left its scars. Yet, as she sat down with a cup of tea, she knew she had won, not just for herself, but for every neighbor who had been affected by Karen's reign. The HOA was finished. Karen was gone, and the community had finally reclaimed its power. The HOA faces full legal consequences. The aftermath of Karen's downfall was swift, and the consequences for the HOA were equally as severe. Mia had played her cards perfectly, exposing the corruption, rallying the community, and bringing the issue to light. Now, the full weight of the law was about to fall on the HOA board members who had allowed Karen's reign of terror to continue unchecked for so long. The city council held an emergency meeting to address the findings of the investigation into the HOA's illegal practices. As Mia sat in the crowded city hall, she couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. This was the moment when everything came together. The very people who had once been too afraid to speak out were now united in their support of Mia. And it showed. The room was filled with neighbors, community members, and even former board members who had decided to testify against Karen and the HOA's corrupt practices. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the HOA had been systematically collecting fines from residents for trivial and fabricated violations. The financial mismanagement was staggering. Millions of dollars had been collected over the years, with much of it funneled into Karen's personal account and the pockets of other board members. The HOA's bylaws had been manipulated to serve Karen's personal agenda, and the damage had been done in secret for far too long. Mia watched as the city council voted unanimously to dissolve the HOA and impose heavy fines on its members. For the first time in years, the community was free from the chokehold that Karen had placed on it. The corrupt HOA was finally gone, and its legacy of fear and intimidation was over. But the punishment didn't stop there. The investigation revealed that Karen had violated multiple laws, including fraud, embezzlement, and harassment. She was not only facing the fines imposed on the HOA, but also personal criminal charges that could land her behind bars for a long time. The media had caught wind of the scandal, and soon Karen's face was plastered all over the news. The same woman who had once strutted around as the unchallenged queen of the neighborhood was now being exposed for what she truly was: a corrupt, power-hungry individual willing to destroy lives for personal gain. The legal consequences for Karen and the other board members were severe. While some of the board members managed to escape jail time through plea deals, Karen was not so lucky. Her criminal trial was a media spectacle, and as the details of her fraudulent activities came to light, it became clear that she would be held accountable for everything she had done. Mia had made sure of it. As the trial progressed, Mia was called to testify. She stood in front of the court, calm and composed, recounting the events that had led to Karen's downfall. Her testimony was a key factor in securing a conviction against Karen, and the prosecutor used Mia's detailed records and evidence to paint a damning picture of Karen's abuse of power. Karen Mitchell, Mia said in her closing statement, has caused countless people to live in fear, to be bullied, and to pay fines for things they never should have been penalized for. I've fought for what's right, not just for myself, but for this entire community. And I will continue to fight until Karen, and the system that enabled her, are brought to justice. With those words, Mia had sealed Karen's fate. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a guilty verdict. Karen was sentenced to prison time for her crimes, and the news spread like wildfire across the neighborhood. The community had won, not just a legal battle, but a moral victory that would be remembered for years to come. In the months that followed, Mia continued to work on improving the neighborhood. She organized community events, helped to rebuild trust among the residents, and ensured that the HOA's corruption was never forgotten. The residents were no longer afraid to stand up for their rights, and the once oppressive HOA was gone for good. Karen, on the other hand, had lost everything. Her house was seized to pay off her fines, and her once pristine reputation was destroyed. She had gone from a position of power and authority to a convicted criminal, with no one left to defend her. As Mia stood in her front yard one evening, watching the sun set over the peaceful neighborhood, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The battle was over, and justice had been served. The neighborhood was free, and the people were no longer living under the shadow of an unjust HOA. Mia had done more than just fight for her home. She had fought for the entire community, and in the end she had won. Karen's personal downfall. Karen's final moments of defiance were a painful reminder of how far she had fallen. Once the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, she was now facing the harsh reality of her actions. The court's ruling had sealed her fate, and her life was unraveling faster than she could have ever imagined. In the weeks following her conviction, Karen's personal life came crashing down. The humiliation was unbearable. The for sale sign that had appeared in front of her house was just the beginning. Soon, the once manicured yard and pristine exterior were replaced with an air of abandonment, as the house sat empty, waiting for the final sale. It wasn't just her house that was lost. Karen had no choice but to part with everything she'd once held dear. She had lost her reputation, her position of power, and now her freedom. No longer able to command the respect she once demanded, Karen found herself at the mercy of the very system she had tried to manipulate. Mia had watched from the sidelines as Karen's downfall continued, feeling a sense of bittersweet justice. There was a part of her that didn't want to gloat. After all, Karen had been a neighbor, someone who had once been an ally of the community. But the truth was, Karen had been a tyrant, and the community was better off without her. One day, while Mia was out for a walk with her dog, she saw Karen in the distance. She was standing outside City Hall, clutching a stack of papers in her hands. From the look on her face, Mia could tell Karen was trying to appeal her case, desperate to reverse the damage that had been done. She was arguing with the receptionist, her voice rising in frustration, but Mia could hear the cracks in her tone. "Please, you have to understand," Karen was saying. "I made a mistake. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I just wanted things to be perfect." Mia watched from across the street, feeling a small pang of sympathy, but it quickly dissipated. Karen had had her chance, and she had squandered it. Later that week, Mia received a phone call from one of the residents. "Mia, you're not going to believe this," her neighbor said, voice filled with disbelief. "Karen's working at another HOA. I heard she's been trying to get involved in a new neighborhood association up north. Can you believe that?" Mia couldn't help but laugh. It was almost too perfect. Karen, ever the opportunist, was trying to crawl her way back into a position of power. But Mia knew that it wasn't going to work. The community had seen her for who she really was, and there was no escaping that. Mia spent the next few weeks focusing on rebuilding the neighborhood. Community meetings were held in place of HOA gatherings, and residents worked together to create a neighborhood association that was fair, transparent, and above all, welcoming. People who had once been hesitant to speak out now felt empowered, knowing that they would never again have to fear the oppressive reign of someone like Karen. As for Karen, her career in the world of HOAs came to a swift end. She was caught in a meeting, attempting to manipulate the system for her own benefit once again. The board of the new HOA caught wind of her past, and before long, Karen was asked to leave, her second attempt at reclaiming control crushed. Mia's satisfaction wasn't born from seeing Karen fail. It was from knowing that the community had grown stronger, more unified, and more resilient because of everything they had been through. In the end, Karen wasn't the only one who had lost something. The entire HOA system, once a source of fear and control, had been dismantled, and the residents had reclaimed their power. As the months passed, Mia continued to look out for her neighbors, ensuring that the mistakes of the past were never repeated. And while Karen may have tried to rebuild her life, Mia knew that the true justice came not from her defeat, but from the community's rise. Epilogue and final mic drop. The neighborhood had changed. What was once a place of quiet fear and silent resentment was now a thriving, united community. The oppressive shadow of the HOA was gone, and with it, the fear that had lingered for so long. The residents, once divided by Karen's harsh rule, now looked out for each other, no longer afraid to voice their concerns or stand up for what was right. Mia walked down the street one afternoon, her dog trotting happily beside her, as she took in the new, vibrant atmosphere of her neighborhood. Children played on the sidewalks, neighbors chatted over their fences, and the once dreaded HOA office was now a place of fond memories, where they held regular community meetings to ensure everyone had a voice. Mia stopped in front of her house, enjoying the peace that had finally settled over the area. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago, she had been embroiled in a legal battle, fighting against an entity that had tried to take away her home, her peace, and her community. But now, with Karen gone and the HOA disbanded, Mia felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. As she walked into her house, she was greeted by a voice on the phone. It was Mrs. Thomas, her longtime neighbor, who had been an outspoken supporter from the beginning. "Mia," Mrs. Thomas said, her voice full of mischief, "you're not going to believe this." Mia couldn't help but smile. "What is it now?" "They handed me a violation notice yesterday," Mrs. Thomas continued, her tone playful. "I think they've mistaken me for you, or maybe they just want to see how far they can push their luck now that Karen's gone." Mia chuckled and shook her head. "If they only knew," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "They really think they can get away with this again?" A few seconds later, the doorbell rang. Mia opened it to find one of her younger neighbors standing there, holding a piece of paper. "Mia, look at this," the neighbor said, handing her the paper. It was another HOA violation notice, this time for something trivial. Mia grinned. "Well, I guess they really haven't learned their lesson," Mia said, her voice filled with amusement. Mia took the violation notice and turned it over in her hands. She knew exactly what to do with it. Without a second thought, she grabbed a marker and wrote across the front of the notice, "This is what we call a joke." Later that evening, Mia posted a photo of the notice online, captioning it, "Looks like they really tried. But not in my neighborhood." The response was immediate. Hundreds of likes, shares, and comments from her neighbors, all of them standing together in solidarity. The neighborhood had finally found its voice, and no one was going to silence them again. With Karen gone, the community had reclaimed its strength, and Mia had proven that standing up to the powers that be, no matter how small they seemed, was always worth it. As the evening wore on, Mia sat on her porch with a cup of tea, gazing out at the quiet neighborhood that had been restored to its rightful place. The world felt different now, safer, freer. She had fought for her home, and in the process, she had helped her community reclaim its spirit. A neighbor walked past, waving a piece of paper. "Mia, they tried again. Can you believe it?" she laughed. Mia waved back, raising her cup in salute. "They sure did, but they'll never learn." And as the sun set on the peaceful street, Mia knew one thing for sure. The community had won, and Karen's reign of terror had finally ended. The end.